Have you ever felt trapped in a cycle of insecurities, as if you were fighting alone against a world that doesn't understand what you're going through? Clara felt the same way. Each attempt to start over seemed harder than the last, and the weight of an unresolved past kept her from seeing the possibility of a better future. But what if I told you there's a way to break those chains and find the peace we've all been searching for? Today, you'll learn about Clara's journey, a woman who, by facing her own fears and scars, discovered that true freedom comes from forgiving herself. Get ready for a story of resilience, where pain is transformed into strength, and the solution lies within you. Now let's dive into this emotional story, but before we do, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because in the upcoming videos, there will be even more emotional stories waiting for you. Clara stopped in front of the house and looked at the place, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. The sun was setting on the horizon, and the golden light reflected off the worn-out walls of the house. It was small, simple, but seemed to hold the potential for something great. The trees around were filled with dry leaves, gently falling to the ground, creating a peaceful, almost poetic scene. Despite the aged appearance of the facade, something about it drew Clara in a way she couldn't quite explain. For years, she had lived in temporary places. Each move felt like an escape, an attempt to find something that was hers, something that would make her feel anchored, secure. But now, here, in front of that house that seemed to be asking for care, Clara felt for the first time that she had found what she had been searching for, a home. Her steps toward the front door were hesitant, as if her mind hadn't quite adjusted to the idea that now everything was real. The windows, covered in dust and with stained curtains, seemed to remind Clara of the various places where she had never felt a sense of belonging. But at the same time, something inside her told her that this was the chance to start over. And like in a movie scene, she smiled to herself. That house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was a reflection of everything Clara had lived through and what could still be. All she needed now was to put into practice her desire to build something genuine, a peaceful refuge. The door, which had been opened countless times by other tenants, awaited her. When she pulled it, the wood creaked, as if finally being greeted by someone who truly intended to stay. Clara crossed the threshold of that house and entered her new world. It wasn't just the entrance to the house, it was the entrance to a new phase of her life. She felt a wave of optimism growing inside her, as if, crossing that threshold, she was leaving behind a piece of the past and beginning to shape the future with her own hands. The evening light illuminated the living room, revealing a spacious yet empty area. The pale yellow walls needed a splash of color, and the wooden floor, worn by time, gave the sense that the house had stories to tell. Clara could feel that there was life there, and she wasn't alone. Even though she didn't yet know exactly what awaited her, she was determined to write her own story in that place. It was her chance to do things her way, without pressures, without the fears of the past. Just her, the house, and the new beginning that was finally materializing before her eyes. Clara walked deeper into the house, exploring every corner with curiosity. The air was fresh, almost comforting, and the silence was welcoming. There were no disturbing noises, only the sound of Clara's breathing and the rustling of the leaves outside. Everything was calm, as if the house knew that it now had an owner and was ready to be transformed. What once seemed like a simple structure now opened up to her like a vast field of possibilities. The idea of starting a new life there made her feel a warmth in her chest, a sense of belonging she never imagined finding. She sat down in the middle of the room, on the cold floor, and gazed at the high ceilings and the empty walls. She was already starting to imagine how each room could look. The living room would be cozy, the bedroom a peaceful place to rest. Clara had plans for everything, but she knew that every step would be taken slowly, because she understood that the most important thing wasn't rushing to fill the spaces, but the process of making that place a part of who she was. The place, as simple as it was, already had something special. She felt that there, at last, she could stop being a temporary resident. It was no longer time to move addresses. She felt like a plant that, for the first time, had been placed in fertile soil and was about to sprout. She would cultivate that home with her own hands, with care and attention, and most importantly, with patience. Now, the house that once seemed like just a temporary refuge for another stage of her life was becoming the space where Clara would finally put down roots. Something deep inside her told her that the moment she took the first step to transform that place, the transformation would begin within herself. It was no longer just about having a house, it was about building something that represented her, something that would be an extension of who she truly was. And for the first time in a long time, she felt an unexpected calm. She was ready for it. This story is becoming emotional, isn't it? Leave a comment about what you think. Stay here. The story continues. As Clara watched the house, immersed in her thoughts, memories of the past began to make their presence known subtly, but firmly. The scent of aged wood brought her back to the times when she still lived with her mother. In a simple house in the countryside, she still remembered the summer afternoons when the warm breeze would enter through the window and sway the white curtains. The sound of her mother's footsteps around the house, the clattering of the pan being placed on the table, the laughter that echoed when her mother told stories about the days when she was young. These memories were always there, like a soft weight she tried to push away but couldn't entirely. Now, in this place, Clara felt those old memories intertwining with the new beginning she was trying to create. It was as if the past didn't want to be forgotten, and the house, though it was a new space, seemed to carry remnants of that other time. She found herself at the door of the bedroom, staring at the bare walls, and thought of the many conversations with her mother that had taken place there. Her gaze wandered to the simple details of the house, the yellow tone on the walls, the worn wooden floor, the windows that needed new curtains. All of that felt familiar to her, like a distant echo of her old life. But Clara knew she had to move forward. Not more than a few weeks ago, she had made the difficult decision to leave the house where she lived with her father and sister. The relationship between them had become unsustainable, arguments were becoming more frequent, and the silence between the words seemed greater than any attempt at reconciliation. She felt she would need more than just distance to heal the scars left by that environment. The house she was in now would be her opportunity to heal old wounds, to create new memories. Every empty corner she looked at, every unoccupied space, Clara imagined how she could fill it with something different from what had been in her childhood. But it wasn't easy. The past still lingered in the small things, in the involuntary reactions that surfaced at every sound, at every memory. Clara tried to push them away, focusing on what she could control, the transformation of the house, the idea of putting something there that would truly be hers, something without the shadows of what had happened before. The sense that the house was being tested, that she was being tested, permeated the air. She didn't want this house to be just another escape, a temporary place where the shadows of the past could hide. She wanted it to be a refuge, a place where life could be different. But for that, Clara knew she would need to confront the past. Every piece of furniture she placed, every new touch she added to the decor, was an attempt to break away from what had held her back. She knew the journey would be long, that it wouldn't be easy to erase all the memories, but she also knew it wouldn't be impossible. It was a matter of allowing herself to forget, little by little, so she could move forward. Looking at the floor, Clara found herself thinking about the last time she saw her mother smile peacefully. The smile that seemed to shine on her face during the last Christmas they spent together, before everything changed. How life always seemed to slip through her fingers, how the good things were fleeting. She then wondered if she could truly begin again without forgetting those memories. But the answer came with the same clarity she felt when she realized this was the right moment to be here. The past needed to be kept in its proper place. It couldn't be the constant burden. It couldn't dictate the rhythm of her life. Now, it was time to look ahead, to no longer allow the shadows of what happened to overshadow the light of the possibilities that lay before her. The house, with its simple details, was there to be transformed, and with it, Clara would transform her own life as well. It wouldn't be easy, but the transformation of her home would be a metaphor for the internal transformation she knew she had to go through. It was time to let go of everything that held her back. She took one last look around. The house was ready for her. The most important step would be taken, not by changing places, but by changing herself. Clara smiled to herself, and with her heart a little lighter, she made the decision that her house would be a place where the past had its space, but where the future would have more strength. Now, with renewed focus, Clara climbed the stairs and entered the bedroom. Here, she would begin what she knew would be a journey of rediscovery. But unlike before, she was now determined not to let the weight of the past shape what she would become in the future. She was ready to give herself a chance to rebuild, to renew, and most importantly to live without the invisible chains that the past sometimes places on our shoulders. The first days in the new house were quiet. Clara spent the mornings organizing the boxes that were left, placing her things on shelves, adjusting the furniture, and trying to make the space feel welcoming. She knew the process of adaptation would take time, but something else was happening there. The silence was heavy. The house, even with its new life, seemed to echo the emptiness of a previous time, a time she preferred to forget, but that now made itself present in a subtle and unexpected way. It was almost as if the walls were watching. The sound of her actions, the simple movement of shifting an object from one side to the other, seemed to prolong in the empty space, reverberating in a disconcerting way. In every corner, she felt as though remnants of the past still lived there. The sounds from the old house, the words spoken during the years she had grown up, the laughter and the arguments seemed to gain new life in the air, now captured by the cold, inanimate walls. Clara knew that those walls had been built long before she arrived, that they did not carry her memories, but those of the house that had once stood there. The sound of her footsteps felt different, the sound of doors closing, windows rattling in the wind, kitchen utensils falling, everything seemed amplified, intensified in an uncomfortable way. The house was empty, but at the same time, full of echoes. On the first night she slept there, Clara had trouble falling asleep. The silence in the house was unlike anything she had known. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but one that seemed to tighten her chest, as though the environment itself was trying to speak to her. Every creak of the house made her raise her eyes, look around, waiting for something she couldn't identify. The wind, which occasionally whistled through the gaps in the window, created a sound that blended with the creaks and whispers of the building, as if the house were trying to adjust to its new presence. Clara felt that, no matter how much she tried to fill the spaces, the environment seemed to resist. There was a strangeness to every step she took, to every glance she cast toward the corners. It was as if the house, with its weathered walls, was waiting for something she still couldn't understand. Perhaps it was time. Perhaps it was the feeling that nothing could truly be new while the past continued to hover there. However, Clara knew she couldn't allow this to consume her. She wasn't there to be imprisoned by what had been. She was there to create new memories, so that one day, the sound of the walls would simply be the sound of her life happening, without the echoes of a past that couldn't be erased, but also no longer needed to be the protagonist. But for that, she knew she would have to allow herself to confront these sensations, acknowledge the strangeness of the moment, and slowly transform it. In the following days, Clara focused on how she could change the environment, fill it in a way that was lighter, more hers. She began placing plants in the empty corners, adding cushions and colorful fabrics to the furniture, rearranging the pictures on the walls. Every change, no matter how small, seemed to bring something new into the house. She knew it was a gradual process, and that the sound of the walls would change over time. Not that the walls would forget what had happened there before, but that, little by little, the house would begin to sound like hers. The sound of a piece of furniture being placed in place, the soft noise of a book being put on the shelf, the laughter during the first dinners she hosted for the few friends who still stayed close. All of that started to fill the space, transforming the house from a place of silent echoes into a home. The sounds, once empty and uncomfortable, began to have more meaning, reflecting her own journey. Clara still heard the silence, but it now seemed less threatening. There was more room for her own thoughts, for her own memories, and the walls now seemed to listen more than observe. She realized that, by adjusting the environment to her liking, she was also adjusting what she felt inside. The house began to reflect what she was trying to rebuild in her life. The walls, which once resonated with the past, now also carried the sound of a future she was learning to shape. The feeling of creating something new, something that could truly be hers, grew stronger with each passing day. Clara wasn't just rearranging the furniture or decorating the spaces, she was changing her way of seeing life. Every change she made in the house was a way to reconnect with herself. The walls, which once felt like a burden, were now witnesses to a more intimate and transformative process. Clara was, slowly, learning to silence the past, not by ignoring it, but by allowing the present to speak louder. The house, with its sounds, its walls, and its echoes, was becoming the perfect backdrop for creating a new story. She would just need patience, and more importantly, to allow herself to be part of this new beginning. As the days passed and Clara began to settle into the routine of her new house, a new sensation emerged. Something that once seemed to be in the realm of imagination was now becoming more and more real. One afternoon, while she was working at her kitchen table, paper scattered and sunlight streaming through the window, Clara heard a sound. It wasn't just any noise, but something very specific, coming from somewhere in the house. The sound of footsteps. Not hurried steps, but a soft sound, as if someone was walking slowly through the house. The kind of sound you'd make when you don't want to wake anyone but still need to move. Clara paused for a moment, startled, and looked around, trying to identify the source of the sound. The house was empty, just her, but the footsteps continued. They weren't loud, but they were clear enough for her to hear. She wasn't scared anymore, just intrigued, as if trying to solve an invisible riddle that was there, but she couldn't quite reach. During lunch, sitting alone at the table, Clara noticed something even stranger. One of the pictures on the wall, which she had hung on the first day, was gently swaying. It wasn't a strong movement, but enough to catch her attention. Her eyes fixed on the picture, and she observed every movement, trying to find some logical explanation for it. No draft, no vibrations that could have caused the slight swaying. She got up, walked over to the wall, and checked the picture's fixings. Everything seemed in order, but when she returned to her chair, the sound of footsteps started again. Clara shrugged it off. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks. The idea of a living house, one that breathed and communicated with its inhabitants, seemed fascinating. However, that wasn't what she was looking for. She wanted peace. She wanted to create her space without the past creeping in, manifesting in such subtle, yet unsettling ways. The sensation didn't go away. On the contrary, it seemed to intensify. Each day, Clara heard the footsteps at different moments. When she woke up in the morning, when she went downstairs for coffee, the steps would appear again, soft and discreet, but persistent. Sometimes, she would also hear the sound of something being dragged across the wooden floors, as if someone were pulling something heavy, but when she looked, nothing was out of place. She searched for explanations, but nothing seemed to justify what was happening. The house remained empty, yet it didn't feel alone. Clara became more attentive to the small details. One afternoon, while washing dishes, she heard the sound of a sigh. It wasn't the wind, as the day was calm. It wasn't a leaf blowing through the window as the house was shut. It was as though someone were standing next to her, sighing softly, almost as if they were a silent, absent companion. She tried to rationalize. Maybe it was stress, the pressure of adjusting to a new place, the weight of responsibility she was carrying by taking care of herself and the house. The idea of being alone, with no one nearby, could really mess with the mind. Maybe she was beginning to see what she wanted to see. But there was something more. Clara couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't completely alone. Each day, the sensation grew stronger, more tangible, as if a presence was in every corner, silently watching, perhaps even waiting. But waiting for what? What intrigued her most was that, as the days went on, the sound of the footsteps seemed to be not just an isolated phenomenon, but part of a pattern. Clara began to question whether it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But something inside told her it wasn't. She never believed in ghosts or spirits, but now, hearing those steps, she found herself challenged to question her beliefs. The house, in some way, seemed to want to say something. One night, when the house was in complete silence, Clara sat on the living room sofa and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to understand what was happening. She knew she needed to confront it head-on. It wouldn't be healthy to let her mind wander in this state of doubt. So, with a deep breath, she decided to get up and follow the sound. She walked slowly, listening intently to the footsteps that guided her through the hallways. Without realizing, she followed the steps to the second floor of the house, where there was a room she hadn't used yet. She stopped at the door, hesitating, hearing the sound there, clearer than ever. Slowly, she pushed open the door and entered the empty room. The sound stopped immediately. Clara took a deep breath and looked around. The room was intact, except for a small old table in the corner and a window slightly open, letting the cold night air in. She stepped forward, observing the space. But then she noticed something strange. In the mirror on the wall, where her own image was reflected, Clara saw something. It wasn't a clear figure, but a distortion. A sense of movement in the glass, as if someone had come closer. She blinked, trying to see more clearly, but when she looked again, the image had vanished. The echo of a presence seemed clearer than ever. Something was waiting for Clara in that room. What was it? She didn't know, but one thing was clear. The house was full of stories, and maybe now was the time to start listening to them. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The images that had formed in her mind while in the empty room continued to hammer away in her head. The sound of footsteps, the whisper in the mirror, the feeling of being watched without understanding exactly what was going on. She tossed and turned in bed, her mind racing, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. She tried to push away the terrifying thoughts, focusing on her routine, the tasks for the next day, but nothing seemed to work. The house, with its enigmatic sounds, seemed to have taken over her mind. It was then that, for the first time, she remembered the house's former owner, the elderly woman who had lived there before her. Clara didn't know much about the history of the house, but she knew that the woman had lived many years alone until her death. She didn't know exactly how or when the lady had passed away, but something inside her told her that there was more to the story of that house than just the simple tale of an old woman who had gone. The house had been her life, her refuge. Clara felt like something was unfinished, unresolved, as if the past were still alive there, waiting to be told. The next morning didn't bring Clara any relief. She went to the market, bought a few items, and made an effort to distract herself. But when she returned home, something felt different. It was as though the atmosphere in the house had changed. The air felt heavier, as if something was about to happen. She entered the living room and felt a chill run down her spine. The silence was oppressive, but deep down she knew she was not alone. The echo of footsteps, now louder, called her to the hallway. Without hesitation, Clara followed the footsteps, as though being guided by an invisible force. She knew she had to go to the end of this story, or at least understand what was happening. Reaching the end of the hallway, Clara stopped in front of the door to the room. The sound, now stronger, seemed to be coming from within. She knew she had to enter, but fear still made her hesitate. After all, what could she expect from a place that already seemed to carry so many mysteries? With her heart pounding, Clara opened the door. Inside the room, everything was completely silent, but there was something new. On the old table, something was shining, a small object, something she hadn't noticed before. Cautiously approaching, Clara picked up the object in her hands and realized it was an old iron key. It was a simple key, but strangely precious at the same time. She observed the key carefully, wondering what it might open. What did it mean? What did it have to do with the sound of footsteps, the whispers, and the echoes of the past that haunted her? At that moment, Clara felt something. It wasn't a sound or a movement. It was a presence, stronger, more tangible, as if the house were breathing along with her. The sense that the past and the present were intertwining in an inseparable way, that something was about to be revealed. She knew that this key wasn't just a lost object. It was a sign. But a sign of what? What did she need to discover to understand what was happening? With the key in her hand, Clara made a new pact with herself. She would no longer run. She would no longer ignore the house's mysteries. Now she was determined to understand what the past wanted to tell. And to do so, she knew she had to follow the trail left by that small, mysterious object. Clara looked at the mirror one last time, staring at her own reflection. She felt an inexplicable connection to the past, as if somehow she were the key to unlocking the entire story hidden in the house's walls. She knew the past would not let her go until she knew the truth. Not anymore. The echo of a presence was no longer just a sensation. It was a call, a summons to what was coming. And Clara was ready to face whatever was necessary to discover what had truly happened in that house, which she now called home. Clara could no longer ignore the whispers and strange sensations surrounding her. Something inside her told her that the mirror, the object that seemed so strongly connected to the mysterious happenings in the house, held a crucial answer. That night, with the old key still in her hand, she felt an urgency to understand what the reflection could reveal. Something in the mirror, something she didn't fully comprehend yet, was begging to be unraveled. The mirror, which stood in the living room, an old object with a delicate golden frame, had always been a common part of the house. But since Clara moved in, it seemed to have a life of its own. During the day, it was just a decorative item, but at night, when the shadows took over the room, it became more than a reflection. It seemed like a portal, a window to another reality. A place where time and space blurred. The reflection, at times, was not what it should have been. Clara had always felt as though there was something more behind that shiny surface. Without hesitation, she approached the mirror, the key still clenched in her hand. She looked deeply into her reflection, trying to perceive what was there, what lay beyond the glass. She wasn't sure exactly what she was looking for, but she felt that the key had something to do with it. She sensed that her fate was somehow intertwined with that object and what it concealed. Then, with silent determination, Clara placed the key in the mirror's lock. The key fit perfectly, as if it had been made for that moment, for that mirror. Clara turned the key slowly, and a strange warmth spread through her hands, as if the mirror were, in some way, alive. The door creaked open, and Clara felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She was about to discover what lay behind the cold, shiny surface of the mirror. It was a unique moment, and she knew that her life would never be the same after crossing this invisible line between the known and the unknown. When the mirror opened, Clara found something completely unexpected. Instead of the emptiness she had imagined inside, there was a different room. The room was a perfect reflection of her own house, but something was distorted within it. The walls seemed older, and the shadows were denser. The furniture was different. But the strangest thing was that, in one corner, there was a rocking chair, the same chair Clara used in her own bedroom. In the mirror, she saw the chair rocking slowly, though no one was there. Before she could understand what was happening, a figure appeared in the reflected room. Clara shrank back involuntarily. It was a woman, a silent and enigmatic figure. Her appearance was familiar, yet distant, as if she were a memory of a forgotten past. She wore a simple dress, and her eyes, though fixed on Clara, seemed empty, as if seeing something that wasn't there. The woman's hair was disheveled, and she seemed to move slowly, as if floating, not walking. Clara stepped closer to the surface of the mirror, both fascinated and terrified. She tried to call out to the woman, but her voice seemed to vanish. It was as if the sound was absorbed by the thick layer of glass. The woman on the other side, in turn, did not respond. She just continued rocking in the chair, in a repetitive and strange motion. As Clara observed, she noticed something even more disturbing. The reflection of the woman began to change slowly. Her eyes became clearer, more focused, and Clara felt an immediate connection with that gaze. It was as if the woman were trying to tell her something, as if her look was asking for help, or perhaps an explanation. But before Clara could make any move, something unexpected happened. The woman in the mirror stopped rocking and slowly began to turn to face Clara. The silence in the house was deafening. It was a palpable tension, as if the air itself was charged with a dense energy. Clara felt her heart pounding in her chest, the pressure rising in her ears. She was about to face something beyond her understanding, beyond anything she could imagine. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a door to something much deeper and more mysterious. It was as if the woman had finally recognized Clara, as if she were the key to releasing what had been trapped there for so long. And suddenly, time seemed to distort around Clara. She didn't know if it was a vision of the past, a manifestation of the present, or a glimpse of a future yet to come. Now more than ever, Clara felt there was a story to be told, a story that had been silenced, trapped behind that mirror. But she also knew that by discovering the truth, there would be no turning back. She was about to enter a territory where the unknown and the supernatural intertwined, and there was no way out. The only choice was to move forward and unravel the mysteries the mirror held, and, more importantly, to discover who the woman was that inhabited it and what she wanted from Clara. What happened next was so surreal that Clara couldn't distinguish whether she was dreaming or if reality had distorted irreversibly. The woman in the mirror, who had previously seemed like a simple, enigmatic presence, was now standing right in front of Clara, as if the barrier between the two worlds had shattered. The reflection of the woman, which had remained motionless until then, began to move. She stared intently at Clara with an intensity that made the air around them feel heavier, charged with an invisible energy. Clara tried to step back, but something held her in place. It wasn't a physical force, but a deep sensation that her curiosity, or perhaps her destiny, kept her rooted to the spot, watching that woman. The woman's eyes were the most penetrating Clara had ever seen. They weren't empty, as she had first thought, but eyes that carried an ancient pain and suffering. It was as if she had lived many lives, each marked by loss, hard choices, and an endless waiting. "You finally arrived," the woman murmured, her voice echoing through the mirror in a surreal way, as if the words weren't being spoken by her, but by the house itself. Her voice was soft but filled with a melancholy that Clara felt weighing on her heart. It wasn't the voice of an ordinary person. It felt as though the woman were speaking across time, as if the words had been spoken long, long ago, and only now, in this exact moment, were they being heard. Clara swallowed hard, still paralyzed. She knew she shouldn't believe what she was hearing, but there was something in that voice that made her question her own perception of reality. The mirror wasn't just a mirror. It didn't just reflect images. It held stories, traumas, and truths that had been buried deep within the house. "I was forgotten," the woman continued, her expression unreadable. "But I never left. I'm trapped here, waiting for you. You are the key to everything." The words reverberated in Clara's mind. The key. The key she was still holding tightly in her hand. She looked at the key, and for a moment, everything made sense. It wasn't just a key to the mirror. It was the key to something bigger, something she didn't fully understand yet. The mirror wasn't just a decorative object. It was a portal. And the woman wasn't just asking for help. She was handing Clara a burden, one that Clara was somehow destined to carry. Clara stepped closer to the mirror, her heart pounding, but her legs still felt heavy, as if the force of that supernatural presence was anchoring her to that moment. She didn't know what to do. She felt an irresistible impulse to ask the woman who she was, what had happened to her, and how all of this connected with her, Clara. But the words wouldn't come. All she could do was gaze into the woman's eyes, those deep and desperate eyes, which seemed to be asking something of Clara, something Clara didn't even know if she could give. Then, suddenly, the woman moved. Slowly, she raised her hand and touched the surface of the mirror. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine, as if a cold wave had swept through the room. The woman made a gesture, as if inviting Clara to touch her too, as if she wanted Clara to come to her, cross the reflection, and join the world the woman inhabited. Clara extended her hand, hesitantly, but she couldn't touch the surface of the mirror. Something stopped her. It was an invisible force, but one that was incredibly strong. She realized that, even though the woman was there in the reflection, there was still a fine line between the physical world and the world of the mirror. "You cannot go yet," the woman said once more in that soft voice, but full of painful wisdom. "There's something you need to understand. Something you need to see." Clara once again felt the weight of the words. Something she needed to see. The mirror wasn't just a reflection of the present. It was a window into the past, into secrets that had been hidden for years, perhaps decades. It was as if the woman was asking Clara to look beyond the glass, to look through time, to understand the story behind her imprisonment. The woman took a step back, and the environment reflected in the mirror distorted even further. Clara saw flashes of images: a child running through the house, a familiar figure at the back of a dark garden, a locked door, and finally, the image of the face of a man, with cold and threatening eyes. The images were fleeting, as if they were being revealed by an old film projector. But even though Clara barely had time to process what she was seeing, she knew it wasn't random. The images were being shown to her for a reason. They were the keys to the puzzle that involved the mirror, the woman, and perhaps the entire house. "Are you ready to know the truth?" the woman asked. "Are you ready to face what's hidden? Or will you run away, like everyone else before you?" Time seemed suspended. Clara felt a growing pressure in her chest. She didn't know what the truth the woman referred to was, but something inside her told her that if she didn't uncover it, her life would never be the same. She was on the edge of something much larger, something beyond her understanding. But somehow, she knew she had to face it. With the woman's words still echoing in the room, Clara couldn't shake the growing weight on her chest. Every part of her being seemed to scream for her to look closer, to see beyond the mirror, beyond that woman. She didn't know what she was about to discover, but she knew there was no turning back. The enigma was in her hands, and there was no choice but to face the shadows of the past that loomed before her. The woman in the mirror was no longer speaking. She simply watched Clara with a silent intensity, as if waiting for her to take the initiative. Clara stared at the glass, her eyes still fixed on the fleeting images that had appeared earlier. Those flashes. A child, a shadowy garden, a locked door, and the face of that man with icy eyes. Each of these images seemed to be etched into her memory, as if they were familiar yet strangely distant. Suddenly, as if something had unlocked within her, Clara remembered. The child in the garden, it couldn't be. She felt a shiver run down her spine. That child was her. The face of that man. She didn't fully recognize it, but somehow he seemed important. But why were these memories resurfacing now, after all this time? She needed to understand. With an almost instinctive movement, Clara stepped forward. Her hands were trembling, but she knew she couldn't hesitate. The reflection of the woman didn't move, but something in the environment began to change. The mirror, once clear and simple, now seemed denser, as if it were absorbing the entire energy of the room. The air around her thickened, as if time was finally revealing itself. The images in the mirror began to intensify, and Clara felt an invisible force pulling her closer. The child running through the garden became clearer. Now she was at the center of the scene. Clara's focus on the face of the child, who was playing with a doll. Clara looked at herself in the image, observing the younger version of herself, with disheveled hair and a happy expression. But something was wrong, something unsettling. The child seemed to be ignoring the shadow that was approaching, a shadow that slowly became a man. His eyes, now clearer, were the same as the man in the other images. He walked toward the child with a blank expression, as if he were destined to be part of that moment. "Who is he?" Clara whispered to herself, but the answer didn't come. The mirror seemed to feed off her questions, more than offering any answers. She was becoming immersed, both physically and emotionally, in the riddle the reflection presented to her. Suddenly, the man extended his hand, and the child, as if she knew him, took the doll and handed it to him. The gesture seemed simple, but there was something unsettling about that exchange. The doll, with its empty eyes, was more than a toy. It seemed like a symbol of something lost, something that shouldn't be touched, but was, nonetheless, being handled. Clara couldn't watch any longer and took another step forward. She needed to know what happened next, what this scene meant to her. She knew deep down that this was the key. She looked at the woman in the mirror, who still remained impassive, but her eyes conveyed an expression that Clara couldn't ignore, a look of warning. "You're seeing it all wrong," the woman said, her voice now heavy with a grave tone. "This isn't a memory of yours, but something that was left for you. A story that was interrupted, a life that didn't end." The phrase echoed in Clara's mind, but before she could process it, the images began to distort even more. The man, once still, began to move with frightening speed. He approached the child, and the tension in the air grew palpable. Clara felt the air around her condense, as if she were in a tight space, being swallowed by the room. But, as the man approached, his image began to blur and disappear, replaced by a different figure. It was a woman, with the same intense eyes and an expression of eternal suffering. This woman was none other than the figure Clara saw in the mirror. The mirror was showing her not a story from the past, but the present of a story still incomplete, one that needed resolution. The woman was trapped in that moment, caught between worlds, waiting for Clara to understand what had happened, what needed to be done. You are the key," the woman said, her voice now barely a whisper. "You need to break the cycle. Free us." The words fell like a weight on Clara. She didn't know how, but the truth was finally before her. The mirror wasn't just a reflection of the past. It was a prison, a time capsule where the souls of those forgotten were condemned to remain, repeating their stories endlessly. Clara now understood that she had the power to set them free. But how? How could she break a cycle that seemed so indestructible? The woman in the mirror said nothing more, but her eyes continued to shine with immense intensity, as if waiting for an action from Clara, a decision she had to make to restore peace. Clara looked at the key in her hand. The key was glowing, vibrating slightly, as if it were asking to be used. She didn't know what she would do next, but she knew she had to act. And the action began with that mirror, with the key in her hand, and with the woman waiting in the reflection, asking for her help. "Hello. Are you enjoying this beautiful story? Let's continue, but before we do, I noticed that you haven't left your like on this video yet. This is really important so that YouTube continues to promote our content to you, and we can keep bringing you emotional stories. So go ahead and leave a like on this story. Thank you." Clara's gaze remained fixed on the key in her hands, feeling a growing pressure in her chest. She knew this moment was decisive. She couldn't just turn her back on what she had just discovered. That key, which seemed harmless, now represented much more than a simple object. It was the key to something deep, something ancient and mysterious, tied to her fate and the fate of the woman in the mirror. The reflection of the woman still watched her, her piercing eyes not allowing Clara to rest. The silence was heavy, interrupted only by Clara's tense breathing. How should she use the key? What would happen if the cycle was broken? Thousands of questions swirled in her mind, but a strong sense of urgency pushed her to act. She no longer had time for doubts. With a firm step, Clara moved closer to the mirror. The cold, shiny surface seemed to absorb her presence, as if the mirror was inviting her into its distorted reality. The woman's reflection seemed clearer now, more tangible, as though the glass was becoming a portal to another world. Clara felt the key pulse in her hands, as if it were vibrating in sync with the energy emanating from the room. She could no longer hesitate. Not knowing exactly what would happen, Clara raised the key and, with a decisive motion, inserted it into the frame of the mirror. The sound that followed wasn't metal striking glass, but something unhinging, something breaking apart. The mirror began to shine intensely, as if an invisible force was being released. The environment around her seemed to disappear for a moment, and Clara had the sensation of being pulled into the mirror, as if transported to another dimension. The space around her distorted. The wooden floor vanished, and she felt herself floating in the void, surrounded by a dense darkness. However, at the center of that darkness, a faint light began to shine. It was the light of the woman in the mirror, now clearer, more alive. She was closer, as if the space between Clara and her had been reduced to the bare minimum. "You made the right choice," said the woman, her voice echoing softly, but full of meaning. "Now the cycle is about to be broken. But you need to be strong, Clara. Don't let fear paralyze you." Clara tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. She was completely immersed in the experience, and the feeling of being in two places at once was overwhelming. She was inside the mirror, but she could still feel the reality on the other side, as if trapped in a limbo between two worlds. The woman in the mirror moved closer, and Clara finally saw her face clearly. It was not just a distant image, but someone real, someone who looked at her with eyes full of hope. "You are not alone," said the woman. "Your journey is ours, Clara. It is the journey of all those who were forgotten, all those who were trapped in the cycle. You have the power to set us free, to finally end all of this. The words carried a tremendous weight, and Clara felt a wave of responsibility sweep over her. But at the same time, she felt something she had never felt before, a deep connection with this woman, as if, somehow, they were parts of a whole, a single soul divided between two worlds. "How can I help you?" Clara asked, her voice echoing in the emptiness. "How can I set you free?" The woman smiled, a sad smile, but full of gratitude. "The key is not just to open doors, Clara. It is to open hearts, to break the chains that bind us, the chains you cannot see, but that have always been there. Now look around you." Clara followed the woman's advice. She looked at the darkness around her and slowly began to notice that the shadows, once indistinct, were starting to take shape, to form. It was as if the space was reconfiguring, creating images, memories. She saw flashes of scenes, fragments of lives, interrupted stories, people who had been victims of circumstances beyond their control, whose stories had never been told. "These are the souls you can set free," said the woman. "These are the voices that were muffled, the stories that were erased. But there's a price to pay, Clara. The cycle will not be broken without a sacrifice." Clara felt a lump in her throat. What did this mean? What kind of sacrifice would be necessary to restore peace, to end the cycle of suffering? The woman in the mirror looked directly at Clara, her penetrating eyes. "The sacrifice is what you fear most, but it is also what you need to face the most. Fear is the last chain to be broken." Clara could no longer see the shadows around her. Everything seemed to be dissolving, as if the world was disintegrating, leaving only the woman and Clara, immersed in a growing emptiness. But something within Clara ignited. The fear, the one that had paralyzed her for so long, was no longer a threat. She was ready to face the truth, to break with the past, and finally understand what had brought her here. "I'll do whatever it takes," Clara said, her voice firm, determined. The woman smiled, but this time the smile was one of relief. "Then the cycle will be broken. The end is only the beginning." The mirror, once opaque and closed, now seemed like a window. The light around Clara intensified, and she knew, in her heart, that she was about to take the final step. The light around Clara seemed to consume the space, as if every atom in the room was being transformed, reorganized, as if time itself was being rewritten. The woman in the mirror, now completely close to Clara, seemed to emanate an energy beyond comprehension. Clara could feel that, in that moment, something was about to happen. Something big. Something that would require from her not only courage, but also the acceptance of a truth that could change everything she knew about herself. She looked at the woman in the mirror, whose eyes were deep and infinite, as if reflecting not only the present reality, but also all possible futures, all forgotten pasts. The woman smiled softly, but it was not a smile of happiness. It was more of a smile from someone who had finally found someone willing to face the inevitable. "Are you ready?" the woman asked, her voice now more distant, as if time were stretching and compressing at the same time. "The sacrifice you will have to make is not small. It may cost more than you imagine." Clara had no doubts. In her heart, she felt that the only thing that could truly set her free, and everyone trapped in that cycle, was fully understanding the true essence of what she had carried for so long. The key was not only to open a portal. It was also there to open Clara's eyes, to reveal a painful and, at the same time, liberating truth. "Tell me what I must do," Clara said, her voice now full of determination. She no longer wanted to hide. She no longer wanted to run away. The woman in the mirror tilted her head and, with an almost imperceptible gesture, pointed to the ground beneath Clara. The moment her eyes followed the gesture, the darkness around her dissipated, revealing a crystalline surface, a kind of tranquil and deep lake. Clara approached, watching the mirrored water that now reflected not only her image, but something much deeper. At the bottom of the lake, shapes moved. They were distorted figures, undefined forms that seemed to float beneath the surface. They were not like shadows. They were more like echoes of something lost, distant reflections of souls that had already existed, but for some reason were no longer present. "These are the memories," said the woman in the mirror, now with a tone of sadness. "Memories of past lives, of decisions not made, of moments of pain and regret. But the greatest of all memories," Clara, is yours. It is what you carry with you, without even knowing. Clara looked at the lake, her eyes now fixed on the figures slowly swimming beneath the water. The images became clearer, more focused. She saw scenes of her own life, moments she had forgotten, places she no longer recognized, faces of people who had faded from her path. But the most frightening of all was when she saw a particular figure, which seemed to be a version of herself, but distorted, as if it were a version lost in time. A Clara who had never existed but was there, in that moment, looking directly at her. "Who is this version of me?" Clara asked, her voice almost a whisper, as if she feared the answer. The woman in the mirror sighed. "She is you, Clara. She represents what you could have been, what you could have become, had you made different choices. But more importantly, she is the part of you that you have avoided confronting. She is the fear of looking inside yourself and realizing that, no matter how hard you try to run, you will never be able to escape who you really are." The woman's words penetrated deeply into Clara's heart. She had always believed that her life was determined by the circumstances around her, that she was a victim of something greater, something beyond her control. But now she understood. The cycle she feared so much was not something external. It was a prison she had created herself, a prison made of her own choices, her own doubts and insecurities. The woman in the mirror continued, "The sacrifice you must make is not about abandoning something material. It is not about losing something tangible. The sacrifice is accepting your own truth, even if it scares you. You need to let go of the version of yourself that lives in fear and embrace who you truly are." Clara remained silent, watching the forms swimming in the lake. Each movement seemed to reflect her own journey, the moments of doubt, the wrong decisions, the steps she took without thinking of the consequences. But at the same time, she also saw flashes of moments when she had been strong, moments when she had done what was right, even when everything seemed lost. She realized that her life was not a sea of wrong choices, but rather a balance between light and darkness, between fear and courage. This was what the woman meant. The sacrifice was not about losing something she loved or feared, but about accepting that the path to freedom lay in understanding herself, in having the courage to be who she truly was. With a deep sigh, Clara closed her eyes and did the only thing she could do in that moment. She surrendered to the truth. No longer running from the memories that haunted her, no longer fearing the woman in the mirror, no longer hiding who she truly was. Clara was finally ready to break the cycle. Clara knelt, the truth finally revealed in her soul. As she looked into the lake, she no longer saw distorted figures, but a version of herself, whole and strong, smiling. The woman in the mirror vanished, leaving Clara alone, but never again lost. With a light heart and a clear mind, she understood. The greatest sacrifice was not the pain, but the forgiveness of herself. Now, she was free, released to live her truth, finally at peace. What did you think of this story? Leave a comment and mention the part you liked the most. Thank you for watching until the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming exciting videos. See you in the next story.